So I'd like to start today by talking about principles. What is a principle? What are some of your principles, right? Just think for a moment, what do you build your life on? What do you build your decisions on? You know, what's the filter that you run things through as you begin making decisions? So some people consider your principles your values, or the things upon which you sort of build your life and make your decisions and guide your actions. These are your principles. And so two things I want to cover today is related to the United States Constitution. The first is the structure of the United States Constitution, just kind of the parts and pieces of it, just real briefly. And then the second, and I would argue more important, is the principles upon which the Constitution is built, the ideas or the values that the Constitution embraces, and that the writers of the Constitution embraced, certainly imperfectly, but to a large degree, they built the Constitution upon these things. Two quotes I'll start with. One, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. This is James Madison, and he wrote this in Federalist number 51. You might remember the Federalist Papers. These were articles in support of the United States Constitution, which was controversial at the time, because we were basically just got rid of a strong government, and the Constitution was offering to set up a new strong government, and so people were fearful. So James Madison and John Jay and Alexander Hamilton, they wrote a bunch of articles collectively called the Federalist Papers that defended the Constitution. And one of the principles that James Madison puts out is displayed through this quote. And he's basically saying, you know, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. He's saying that people aren't perfect. People are imperfect, and if we were, we wouldn't need a government. But since we're not perfect, we need a government to essentially help us regulate our relationship amongst each other. And so since people aren't perfect, you know, also that government's not going to be perfect. This is one of the things that James Madison sort of proposed and is symbolized by this quote. Secondly is a quote from George Washington where he says, government is not reason, it is not eloquent, it is force. Like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearful master. And George Washington, the principle he's putting forth here is that government is a tool. That government is not reasonable, or government is not necessarily moral or immoral. It's force. It's able to take people's lives and property and you know, if we're going to imbue a government with that type of power, we got to be very, very careful. You know, much like you Boy Scouts, you might put a ring of rocks around a fire to control it. You know, it's a great tool, but at the same time, you've got to be careful with it. And so that's what Washington felt about government. And so these are two of the principles that kind of get embodied in the founding of our country, and upon which the Constitution is built. Let me go into a little more detail about the Constitution now. First of all, the Constitution, it's the plan and guidelines for our national or federal government. It's basically the law of the land. It's basically the basic document that spells out how our government's going to be set up, how the different parts of our government interact with each other, how laws are made, how laws are enforced, how laws are interpreted. These things are all set up within our United States Constitution. So again, the plan or guidelines, this is the actual Constitution itself. And the Constitution has many different parts. These different parts we call articles. Before the articles is a preamble. There's an introduction. Some of you may have heard it on Schoolhouse Rock. I certainly did as a kid. Okay, I'm dating myself. This is like 30, 40 years ago. But this just lays out the general goals for the Constitution. So provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare. These things are all spelled out in the Constitution. Of note is that the Constitution starts with the phrase, we the people, because the Constitution is supposed to represent the will of the entire group of people of the United States, and not just some particular individuals. Again, the Constitution is divided up into articles, and the different articles sort of have different purposes. Article 1 sets up the legislative branch. This describes the House of Representatives and the Senate. It's the legislative branch's job to make laws. Article 2 sets up the executive branch. The executive branch is the president and vice president and all the people that work for him or someday her. The executive branch, their job is to execute or enforce the laws. Maybe the most controversial part of the Constitution, because we had just gotten rid of a king and people didn't want another king. But at the same time, we wanted some kind of mechanism to enforce laws, because under our first government, the Articles of Confederation, there was no executive branch. We sort of just hoped that people follow the laws passed by our Congress. The third article describes the judicial branch. It's rather short. It basically says that Congress can set up a judicial branch the way that they see fit, but it does give the judicial branch the job of interpreting the laws. So once the legislative branch writes a law, what does that law mean? What do those words mean? Ultimately, it's up to the judicial branch, and that power is described in the third article of the Constitution. Article 4 describes relations amongst the states. This idea that states have to recognize each other's laws. So, for example, I'm married to Mrs. Koch, and when we, moved to another state, we moved to Florida or something, when we get old and want to retire, like 60 years from now, Florida is supposed to recognize our marriage. Same with court rulings. If a Pennsylvania court rules something, then other states are supposed to recognize that. So that's laid out in Article 4. Article 5 describes amending the Constitution. There is a process built into the Constitution for changing it. So, for example, there were parts of the Constitution related to slavery that we've changed. We've amended the Constitution 27 times, and all this is spelled out in Article 5, a part of the Constitution that says, here, if you want to change it, here's how you change it. I'll make a note here that amending the Constitution is challenging. It takes 2/3 of Congress and 3/5 of the states to all agree on a change to the Constitution in order to change it. And again, this was deliberate by our founders because they recognized that changes might sometimes be needed, but at the same time, they wanted to make sure that people were really, really sure that you wanted to change the Constitution because they wanted a solid foundation upon which to found our government. Article 6 describes something that's called the Supremacy Clause or Supremacy Article, and it describes how the national government is supreme. Basically, it says that federal laws supersede state or local laws. So again, if there's a disagreement between two laws and one is federal and one is state, ultimately the federal law is supreme. The national government is supreme. Article 7 describes ratification. Basically, the Constitution says within it, here's what it requires to ratify or be passed. And the founders laid out that 9 out of 13 states had to ratify the Constitution in order for it to pass. By 1788, 9 states had, and by the end of 1788, all 13 states had ratified or signed on to the United States Constitution. So those are the different structures. This is the structure of the Constitution, the different articles and what they do, or what they describe. And again, that's pretty brief, but gives you just an understanding a little bit of the structure of the Constitution. Now, I'd like to get into some constitutional principles. These are the values or ideals upon which the Constitution was built. Essentially, the founders, the writers of the Constitution, James Madison in particular, but others, they had a lot of experience with government. They had a lot of experience with studying history, histories of countries, histories of governments, and they really took a lot of time to try to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And certainly they were not perfect men. Certainly they had their flaws, so I'm not trying to paint them out, paint them as demigods or something, as some writers have described them. At the same time, there's no denying the fact that they created a structure for government that's really been incredibly successful for over 200 years, for now well over 300 million people. And so you cannot deny the fact that the Constitution has been a important document making all this so. So the first principle I'd like to describe, one of the building blocks that they built it upon, one of the things I'd like to describe is something called popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty, we've heard this already a little bit around the Civil War. Popular sovereignty is the idea that we, the people, rule. Government gets its power from the people. We applied this to slavery and letting states decide slavery for themselves. So that's related to this, but this is kind of a broader concept or broader principle of popular sovereignty. For thousands of years, people believe that, kings get their powers from God and they're born a king and so they're supposed to rule. Or, the stronger person, was stronger, so they're the people that get to rule. Well, the Constitution's built in the idea that government gets its power from the people. Without the people supporting the government, it's like a contract, then the government has no power. So again, popular sovereignty, popular population or people, sovereignty is rule. Another principle upon which the Constitution is built is limited government. We also call this the rule of law. And this is the idea that laws, like the Constitution, are written to restrict our government and prevent a dictator. So a lot of the other principles are tied back to this, but the idea is our government is set up in a way that it is limited. We don't want the government to have unlimited power over us. And so, for example, we spell out via laws what the government can and can't do. And in fact, some of the laws specifically apply to the government. Just as an example, the president cannot declare war without Congress's approval. So right there, written within the law, is a limitation to the president. The president cannot just take us to war whenever he or someday she feels like it. All right. And again, we want the laws to apply not only to every single citizen, but we want the laws to apply to our government also. Another concept is republicanism. This is the idea that we elect limited representatives. So when people say America is a democracy, that's really only partly true. We are really truly a republic. We're based upon republicanism. And that's not the political party, but that's the idea that we elect representatives to make decisions for us. But those representatives are limited by the Constitution. They are limited by laws. We don't elect people and then they can't just do whatever they want to do. We elect them and they are limited in their power and what it is they're supposed to do. The Constitution says, here are the things they're supposed to do. The Constitution says, here's the things that are left to the states or to individuals. We also have federalism. Federalism is another principle that limits our government. We have a national government and state governments. The Constitution spells out there's certain things the federal government's supposed to do. For example, have an army. At the same time, there are things that the state governments are supposed to do. For example, run schools and give marriage licenses. Many things are left to the states intentionally, again, to keep our federal government, our national government limited and from keeping it from getting out of control. We also believe in separation of powers. This is another principle of the Constitution. And the idea of separation of powers is that we split our government's jobs to keep it weak. One of the ways that we prevent our government from getting out of control is we don't give all the power to the president. We don't give all the power to the Congress. We don't get all the power to the Supreme Court. We separate the powers. We have 3 branches of government. And again, that's intentional. We split our government's jobs to keep it weak. The president does certain things. The Congress does certain things. The Supreme Court does certain things. That's intentional because we don't want any one branch getting out of control. Not only that, but it ties to another principle of checks and balances, and that is parts of our government control other parts. So not only do we separate the powers, but we intentionally set up the president to fight with the Congress, and the Congress to fight with the president, and the Supreme Court to check them both. So all 3 branches are set up to be adversarial. They fight with each other intentionally because by them fighting and checking with each other, that maintains a maximum amount of our freedom. That limits their power. Okay, so I always laugh when I hear people talking about, oh, the government's fighting again with each other. Good. Let them fight. When they're fighting, then they're leaving us alone. They're maximizing our freedom. At the same time, when a decision really needs to be made, then we have the way that the groups interact with each other, the branches interact with each other. They're able to work things out, and we're able to move forward. Finally, the last principle is individual rights. This is the idea that we are each born with freedoms the government must respect and protect. The founders of our country, many of them believe that those rights came from God. You don't have to believe that today, but at the same time, you are born with it. The government does not give you your rights. You don't get your rights from Congress or from Trump or from Obama or from the Supreme Court. You don't get your rights from anybody. You are born with those rights, okay, and endowed by your Creator, if you believe the Declaration of Independence. And so the idea is if you're born with those rights, government cannot take away those rights. In fact, the government must respect and protect those rights. When a government doesn't respect or protect those rights, then you have the right to overturn or throw off that government. We like to do so peacefully through elections, but we may do so even through revolution, as is shown in our past. So this is a real brief summary of our Constitution, both the structure and the principles. Maybe you've thought a little bit about your principles at the beginning here, a little bit of what maybe Madison or Washington felt about it. But again, we're going to go into the Constitution in more detail over the next couple of weeks because most of what we're going to learn is going to tie back to both the structure and the principles of the Constitution. Thank you for listening, and hopefully if you missed class that this presentation will help you some. Have a great day.